Hello. Um, I thought I'd take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about the Korean War, kind of in the IB style. Hopefully, you got a chance to watch that short video that was on there that I posted with a couple of questions from it. But so this slideshow is on Schoology, and you can go back and look at it a little bit. But Korea's in the news a lot lately, as well it should be. And maybe just having a little bit of understanding and a little bit of the historiography behind this war will help you better understand what's happening today. So you can see I've titled this "The Forgotten War." The Korean War doesn't get the glory of World War II. It doesn't have that drama of World War II, and on the surface, it doesn't have the tragedy of the Vietnam War, which has lingered in our thoughts as a nation. So mixed in between those two came this forgotten war, which is technically not a war at all. It was a conflict. There was never an official declaration of war. The president didn't ask one. This is going to be under the UN specifically. And kind of that first major test of the UN is, would they stand up to an aggressor nation attacking a quote unquote victim, if you will. And we'll see how much of a victim South Korea is as we go through this. So, a little bit of the background. We have mentioned this before, but if you remember back to the first Sino-Japanese War, Japan had occupied Korea since 1895, and having won this from China. And the Korean Peninsula has been one of these places on Earth that we talked about a little bit last year, really at the beginning of the year, I should say, about the concept of a nation state. Is that there's been this nation of Koreans, this people of Korea, but they haven't always had their own independent nation states. And so this was part of this struggle of self determination. Well, in 1943, at the Cairo Conference, it was decided by the Allies that they, once Korea was liberated, that they would get their self determination and become an independent state. And so that's part of this goal, and Stalin agrees to this in 1943. But also, if you remember, Stalin also agreed to enter the war with the United States against the Japanese, I should say, 3 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany. And lo and behold, that comes in May of 1945. June, July, August of 1945, the Soviets then enter Manchuria, and they push all the way down to the 38th parallel in what is present day Korea. And so this was August 12th of 1945. And of course, we know this is the time that the United States is also using nuclear weapons. And so the United States is going to occupy the South. The Soviets are going to occupy the North in kind of a reconstruction period, that they would be in charge of administering government, just like in Germany. But this was meant to be temporary, that there was always going to be this move back to the Cairo Conference, that eventually the Koreans would form their own independent nation state with their own governments and their own sovereignty. And of course, this doesn't occur. The UN, of course, had requested this election be held. And in the South, they have a very corrupt, I'm sorry, in the North, there is no elections. It's going to be taken over by Kim Il sung, which is the grandfather of the current day leader, which in the news yesterday was talking about how he had surgery on his heart, which he's only 36 years old, and that there could be complications from that, but we're really not quite sure. In the South, they are going to have a national assembly that's going to form, and they're going to form behind this anti-communist Sigmund Rhee. And Sigmund Rhee had actually been educated in the United States. He was a Methodist preacher, so he was Christian, but he's no Democrat, if you will. He doesn't really support democracy. There's all sorts of corruption. There's all sorts of physical abuse towards them. And we'll see as this goes through that just being anti communist made you a friend of the Americans. It didn't mean that you adhered to this concept of individual rights and liberties along the way. So we have two distinct governments then, one in the South and one in the North. So the de facto partition, though, had become permanent. Both governments, and here's where we look at this as a civil war, is both governments claim the authority over the entire country. I want to think in terms of like in Bleeding Kansas, if you will, where there were two constitutions that are written. One's going to be a pro slavery constitution. One's going to be an anti slavery constitution. Both claiming to be the legitimate governments of Kansas, and this is what happens in Korea. Both of them claim to be the legitimate government, and each of them threaten the other side by force. The North threatens the South threatens the North. And when you look through the history of partitioning countries, it almost is never successful. A matter of fact, I can't think of very many times it will be successful. It's going to fail in Korea and lead to brutal war. It's going to fail in Vietnam and lead to a brutal war. It's going to fail in Ireland in 1921. It's going to fail in India with the partition of India. It's going to fail in the partition of Palestine and the creation of Israel. And we haven't quite learned how to get through this. And I don't know that there's a simple answer to these complex problems. But when you have people that view themselves as being the power in that region, and then that power is challenged, we oftentimes find conflict, as you can imagine. So looking at the original plan is that the Soviets are going to withdraw and the Americans are going to withdraw, and they both do this. In December of 1948, the Soviets withdraw their forces, mostly because it's extending into their budget. It's being very expensive to do this. The Americans are going to withdraw in June of 1949. But when the Americans withdraw in June, they actually move their troops to Japan. So we're currently occupying Japan in 1949. So they don't necessarily come all the way home, but what they did as they left is that both sides, the Soviets and the Americans, armed the other side. So as the Soviets leave, they leave their weapons, they leave their munitions, and the Americans do the same. So essentially, we've armed the Soviets and the Americans, we've armed these two sides with what they need to fight a civil war. So we look at this through two lenses. One, it's a good old fashioned civil war, it's Koreans against Koreans, both claiming to be a legitimate government, both wanting to unify under the nationalist concepts of Korea. And of course, they're going to differ on their political concepts and economic concepts, but on the nationalistic issues, they don't. But it's also a proxy Cold War in that it pits this idea of communism versus capitalism and this fighting of indirectly between the Soviets and the Americans. And of course, the Americans are actively going to be fighting where, quote unquote, the Soviets are not. There will be some engagements with Soviet fighter pilots over North Korea, but it's kind of kept secret at the time. So it doesn't escalate into something bigger than what it was. So the causes of the Korean War. So when we look around, um, this is a quote that I found by Edwin Polly, who was Truman's ambassador, that was looking around at investigating reparations and reparations specifically that Japan was going to be forced to pay. And when Polly gets to Korea, he has this incredible quote. He says that communism in Korea could get off to a better start than practically anywhere else in the world. And essentially, what he says is it's ripe for the picking. When you look around at Korea and you see the issues that they have, when you see a landless peasantry, when you see an elite class that's come to the forefront that's looking to take this even more power, when you look at the job situation, and remember when we said when people don't have jobs and people don't have food, radical ideas look pretty good, and that's what's going on in Korea. And this isn't the first time, and it's not going to be the last, that the United States continues to have this idea of spreading capitalism and spreading democracy. It's not easy, and oftentimes it fails because there isn't this sense of rule of law and because there isn't a middle class. And so we'll see how this plays out. So Polly kind of predicts in 1946 that communism is going to come to power, or it could come to power in Korea. Mind you, this is before the Communist Party has come to power in China in 1949 under Mao. So the actual breaking out of the war is between October of 49 and June of 49. There were thousands of soldiers killed all along the 38th parallel. They were firing shots back and forth, and in fact, it is estimated that the South actually invaded the North more times in this time period, in this 6, 7, 8 months time period with this. But things changed though in the summer of 1950. The U.S. Secretary of State, who of course is in charge of the foreign policy of the United States, or acting as for the president in foreign policies, outlines what the United States' policy is going to be in Asia, and he makes a very, very critical mistake. He has this poster behind him that's a map of Asia, and there's circles around this, and these circles show what the Americans. My dogs are fighting. What the Americans' sphere of influence is going to be, and it fails to include two key strategic points. The first one is South Korea. There's no mention of South Korea, and the second is Taiwan. And so many historians see this as being that green light to North Korea, that the United States isn't going to defend South Korea. Dean Acheson just stood up, said essentially by not saying that South Korea is not part of our sphere of influence, therefore, we're not going to risk. It also sends the green light to Mao in some ways about Taiwan, because remember, this is where Chiang Kai shek has fled after the Chinese Civil War has ended. So on June 25th, 1950, just shortly after Atchison leaves this out, North Korea invades South Korea below the 38th parallel, and thus the Civil War of Korea begins. There's another side story to this as well, going back to that Taiwan issue. The Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council. So we didn't get a chance to talk a lot about the UN before we went on this hiatus, if you will. But one of the things that was created at the UN to make it better than the League of Nations was they created what's known as the Security Council. And the Security Council has an incredible power, and that is the power to veto any military actions. And there are 5 permanent members on this Security Council, and then they have 6 members who rotate into this. So there's a total of 11. Only the 5 permanent members have veto power. And you can kind of maybe guess who those 5 permanent members are and were at this point still. So, of course, the United States is going to be part of this. The British are going to get a part of this. They get the seat at the table. The French, I often question why the French get so much power there, but we'll give them that. The French are there, right? So there's 3. The Soviet Union, of course. And the 5th and final is going to be China, which makes sense. These are the 5 largest powers in the world. But here's the key: the United States doesn't recognize Mao's China as being quote unquote the China. They recognize Chiang Kai shek, Taiwan, as being the real, and they seat the Taiwanese at the Security Council table. And the Soviets are incredibly upset about this. And it makes sense that here you have a nation of 750 million not being represented, and you have the island nation of Taiwan that is. And so the Soviet Union decides to boycott the UN Security Council. So, as a result of this, when the United States brings this issue to the UN Security Council, the Soviets are not there to veto it. They could have easily stopped the UN from using forces in Korea, and they did not, because they were boycotting the UN Security Council, and they were able to pass this through. This will be the last time that the Soviet Union would boycott the Security Council, and the Americans have never done this. So even to today, if there is to be some sort of military intervention using UN forces, it must go through the Security Council. There have been several times in my lifetime that this has been used. It was used in Yugoslavia, well, during the Bosniak War, if you will, and more recently in your lifetime, it was also used in Libya to oust the leader of Libya just a few years ago, actually. We also see that during the Persian Gulf War, the UN Security Council will also be used. And at this point, the Soviets, who are on the verge of collapse, do not veto any use of that, although they do not participate. So a little bit of background on the UN Security Council. So long story is, the Soviets are boycotting because they're ticked off, and this is why the UN gets engaged, and the American forces are going to be under the guise of the UN, but it's really going to be Americans. So 2 views. Why in the world would Kim do this? Well, a little bit of the historiography that goes behind this is that one of them was that Kim was acting on Stalin's orders, that this was that diabolical plan of Stalin and that need to spread his influence and to spread the idea of communism. And so why would Stalin then give orders for Kim to do this? As one is to make Kim dependent upon the Soviet Union. They would need them for food supplies. They would also need them for military supplies. And the other was to create a diversion away from Europe, to get the United States' attention out of Europe. Remember, Stalin had just taken a major loss with the Berlin blockade. And so this would maybe help a little bit. And the fact that they're going to form their own military alliance under the Warsaw Pact that isn't really working out so well. And then the other historians say, but this was really no unusual invasion, and this is the revisionist part of it. And it actually says that it's the United States' fault that the United States does this. They specifically encourage this aggression. And in fact, there'll be those who say that the South invades the North so that the United States could take this to the UN, that they knew that the Soviets were boycotting the UN Security Council, and that they baited Kim into this attack, all for their own imperialistic design. So we get Orthodox history, we get revisionist history, and then we get a little bit of post revision. And the post revision actually comes out of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev goes on to replace Stalin after Stalin's death in 1953. And Stalin, Khrushchev does admit, looking at the papers of Stalin, and he was part of the leadership at this point in time, that Stalin does improve. He does approve the invasion, although he says that he doesn't think Stalin really thought this out and what the full consequences would be. And to them, it was a win-win situation. If we support Kim and it works, great, it's good for us. If we support Kim behind the scenes and it doesn't work, well, then what are we out? We're not out anything, because if the Americans take over Korea, they're going to be on China's border and not on our border. So this is where, in the reading it says, however, most likely Kim acted independently in a pursuit of the goal of unification of Korea as a communist state, and that Stalin was unaware of the UN boycott and that and what those consequences would have. He never really believed that the Americans were going to defend the Koreans, and therefore would have never allowed this to occur if he did. There's a couple of quotes right here. You can go back and read these, but there's a lot of a lot of kind of over the top. General MacArthur says that he would defend Korea as he would his own country or his own California, and then you have Harry Truman really using the power of the bully pulpit to rouse support for this war. And so Truman says, that in his generation, this isn't the first time that the strong had attacked the weak. There's that terminology coming out of the Truman Doctrine. There's that terminology coming out of the League of Nations and the UN, that when a stronger nation attacks a weaker nation, we should stand up. So he says, and he makes this claim, that communism was acting in Korea just as Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese had acted in the past, and that he felt certain that if Korea was to fall, South Korea, that the communist leaders would be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores. This is the beginning of the domino theory. It's not going to be called that yet for another couple of years, but you can see this. So we get elements of the Truman Doctrine, we get elements of containment, of course, and we get this elements of the domino theory, that if one country falls, then the rest are going to fall as well. So this is General MacArthur. It's the UN/US forces. If you remember back to World War I, the United States had established the precedent that American troops would never serve under foreign leaders. And so under this UN forces, it's going to be MacArthur that's going to be responsible for American troops. Now, MacArthur, if you remember back to our World War II days, he was the commander of the Philippines and the commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific. He is part of that island hopping campaign of it, and he also is who the Japanese surrendered to on the USS Missouri. And today, Japan's constitution is called the MacArthur Constitution. He will stay as kind of an occupying force after the war to establish this new form of government for them. So, like I said, it's still there. So the sole purpose for restoring the Republic of Korea to its status prior to this, here we go, is containment. That this is the Truman Doctrine, and that the other 14 countries would send their troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, all for the sole purpose of extracting the North Korean forces out of the South and reestablishing that border of the 38th parallel. So, containment war, North Korea is already, it kind of goes back to Kennan's long telegraph, is that North Korea is already under the communist rule. There's nothing we can do about that, but by gosh, we're not going to allow communism to spread. So, thus starts the war. And it goes, as we saw in the video, it goes horribly for the South Korean troops and the American troops that are there. And you can kind of see these lines as this starts off crossing. And the first part of this, they're on the retreat. The American forces and the South Korean forces are in a constant retreat mode, and they get trapped down here on this little area known as Pusan. And it's at this point where drastic circumstances calls for drastic measures. And so Douglas Douglas MacArthur, and then the video you saw this performs this incredible amphibious landing at Incheon, and he does this, and it's really kind of haphazard in some ways. It's daring, it's stupid in others, but in the end, it was successful. They were able to successfully land on these rocky beaches, if you will, and surround the North Korean troops essentially to make them fight this two front war. And so as they find themselves fighting this two front war, you can see this. You can see the retreat lines going back north. So the North Koreans then retreat back across the 38th parallel. Right. So by the end of September, Seoul is liberated and the South is secured, according to this statement here. Then end of the war. This is the containment war. This is to roll back communism from its spread. But Truman and MacArthur make a bold decision, and that is they change the course of the war. They make this, instead of being a containment war, what becomes known as a rollback war. That not only are we going to contain communism, we're going to stop communism on the Korean Peninsula completely. And this gets the attention of the Chinese. The Chinese prime minister is a guy by the name of Zhao Enlai. At this point, Mao is still is still the chief, if you will, of the committee, the head of the committee of the Communist Party. But he has prime minister underneath him that deals in these matters. So Enlai makes this warning. He says, "Listen, if you come too close to China, we're going to come to the North's aid." Truman calls his bluff. He wishes to establish then a United States dominance in Korea, to get this foothold into Asia, if you will. And again, it goes from being a containment war to a rollback war. The United States forces then cross the 38th parallel and begin to chase the North Korean army all the way up to the border of China. And it gets ugly through here. The northern half of Korea is very mountainous and it gets very cold. In fact, if you look at a map, Seoul, South Korea sits on the 40th parallel. It's called Columbus's sister city. It essentially has the exact same climate as Columbus does. They get a hot and steamy summer. They get a nice cool fall, and they get a spring and a winter that goes through this as well. But as you get further north, it gets more like Toronto, and it gets more like Montreal. It gets much more bitter cold, and it's more mountainous in that sense as well. So by the end of October, the United States forces have captured the capital of North Korea, and they continue to push north. And the Chinese then start to get a little bit antsy, and they warn them once again: if you continue pushing north, we're not going to be able to stop our volunteers from stepping over the border and protecting our communist brothers, if you will. And that's exactly what happens. 300,000 quote unquote volunteers from the People's Liberation Army cross the border and begin to drive the United States back beyond the 38th parallel once again. So if you think of this as a tug of war, the North Koreans get the upper hand first. They drive the Americans all the way to the southern half of South Korea. The Americans then, through the amphibious invasion, turn the tide. They roll this all the way back, and they're pushing all the way north towards the Chinese border. China crosses the border, and now they begin to push them back south of the 38th. And Truman changes his plans. He says, okay, I take it back. Then we'll just go back to a containment war. Well, at this point, though, MacArthur is kind of outraged at this, and he calls Truman out in public, and he talks about the idea of a limited war, and he says, no, if they want to fight with us, we have the bomb, they don't have the bomb, let's use it to our advantage. And he says that essentially he demands the authority to blockade China and to bomb Manchuria with atomic weapons if need be. MacArthur ends up calling limited war, and he calls Truman an appeaser. And so the hero of World War II in the Pacific has now publicly called out his boss, the commander in chief. And he's also called for something reckless, of course. And Truman then decides to dismiss MacArthur. He fires him. He doesn't remove him from the army. And MacArthur goes on to give some speeches around the country, and he is kind of given a hero's send off. So he's not embarrassed in that sense. And he replaces him with General Matthew Ridgway. And now they're trying to find a way out of this because, in a way, I understand what MacArthur is talking about. That if you have this bomb and you're not willing to use it, you might as well not have this bomb. that if you could be drawn into these issues, then why even have the bomb? And the next president of the United States takes this same idea, and that's going to be Eisenhower. Here's just some of you can see the mountainous regions on here. It does become partly guerrilla warfare. It becomes trench warfare in the mountains. It gets really, really ugly. It becomes urban warfare. It is a horrific in every way, shape, and form of any war can be. So a last failed Chinese offensive occurs in June of 1951. So the major fighting really occurs in the first few years of this, and they begin to seek an armistice in July. But this just drags on for month after month after month. And one of the big issues that's being held up is what we call repatriation. Uh, both sides are seeking to improve their position. And the big thing that they want is where is this demarcation line going to be and the repatriation of POWs. The North wants a forced repatriation, meaning that the South is to load up all the North Korean political prisoners, put them on a bus, put them on a train, and ship them back across the border. Where the South says that it should be voluntary repatriation, that we're going to open up the gates. And if they want to come back to the North, great. And if they want to stay here, that's fine as well. And you can see where North Korea might have an issue with this because when you're going to, as it turns out, we're going to see that the South is going to have economic opportunities and political opportunities that the North has never. They'll eventually work this out under Truman. I'm sorry, under Eisenhower. At the same time, Sigmund Rhee turns into this even more tyrannical dictator. He begins to impose martial law, begins to arrest opposition and puts them into prisons themselves. And he imposes this right wing dictatorship. And just because he's anti communist, it makes him our friend. But the reality is, he's not very well liked. Um, as you can understand. Here's a quote that I found that even now I feel guilty that I pulled the trigger. And so this is a young South Korean. He's not young when he gives this, but talking about the execution of prisoners and murder and dissent of Sigmund Rhee. Today, and South Korea has changed, and we'll see that as we get through this a little bit. So in comes Eisenhower. So there's I like Ike was his campaign slogan to win the presidency in 1952. And he, of course, had been the Allied commander of all the forces in Europe during World War II. And the communist world was quite fearful of Eisenhower. Here he is, this old war general, and they believe that he is kind of a war hawk, that he's looking to use the nuclear weapons to gain an advantage and to imperialize the world. And in some ways, their thought process is right, but the reality is different. Eisenhower has this idea that he agrees with MacArthur, and you can understand them both being generals of why they would say this. And he comes up with this thing that he calls massive retaliation. That if anybody chooses to go to war with the United States, that every weapon that we have is on the table to be used. He understands that if you're unwilling to use the weapon, you might as well not have the weapon, and that as a result of this, we would continue to get pulled into limited wars that would just continue on and on and on, and we would never be able to get out of the cycle. And how right Eisenhower was. This is exactly what happens. Other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's going to come a little bit later, when you look at the war in Vietnam and you look at the other wars that we fought in where nuclear weapons have never been on the table, we've had these long extracted wars in Vietnam for 10 years, in Afghanistan now for almost 20 years, and Iraq on and off for almost the last 30 years. But nonetheless, this fear of Eisenhower using the bomb does bring the North Koreans to the negotiation table in July of 1953. They decide on this armistice, this laying down of the arms. So the armies are to be separated by the demilitarized zone, and that's at the 38th parallel. And there's even some buildings where literally the building is split in half, and on one half of the room you have the North Koreans, on the other half, and they face off in these ceremonial issues. So it restores that, and then the POWs would be exchanged. This forced repatriation. So those soldiers would be sent back to North Korea, and the South Koreans would be sent back south as well. So the consequences of the war, and this is where we get into a little bit of the fallout that we still have today, is that this is an absolutely brutal war, as all wars are. And it's called the Forgotten War because we don't often acknowledge what comes out of this. These estimates are on the conservative side, but about 2.9 million deaths, 1.3 South Koreans, 1 million Chinese, 500,000 North Koreans, 54,000 American casualties, deaths, about 4,500 allied, so the other 14 nations that supported. In fact, the the Korean Korean War Memorial in Washington D.C. is one of my favorite actually because if you've been there, and most of you probably have, it's kind of interactive. You can walk amongst it, and it lights up at night with the soldiers. So I found that very moving when I was there. 5 million Koreans are left homeless. The South Korea's industrial infrastructure is damaged. North Korea's was devastated due to U.S. bombing. More bombs are dropped in North Korea in that 2.5 year period of the war than was dropped on the entirety of the Second World War. And so it's just massive carpet bombing. The war really failed to resolve the division of Korea. It's still a hot spot today, as it's in the news. It increases the Americans and the Chinese hostilities, and that will finally play itself out under the Nixon administration. And as we see now, there's kind of a neo Cold War with China occurring economically. The UN does save face. They step into a quote unquote developing third world nation to stop an aggressor, unlike they had done in Manchuria when the Japanese became aggressive. This time, when North Korea became aggressive, they stood the challenge and they repulsed the overthrow of South Korea by North Korea, and thus they saved face. It establishes a precedent for U.S. intervention in Asia to contain communist expansion. This is going to take us into the Vietnam War. It's going to increase U.S. paranoia of communism. This is the time of McCarthyism. The United States' budget goes from like $13 billion militarily to $50 billion in just a few years. And this means an increase in taxes. This is an increase in paranoia. And again, if you remember from AP studies, the things of McCarthy, and we don't have time in this. There would be no more limited wars under Eisenhower. That massive retaliation would be our policy. That if you choose to go to war with the United States, we will use any and all weapons. We will change this later back. Both Koreans armed themselves using precious resources that they need. And this is really where we see North Korea today trying to establish their own nuclear arsenal and at the same time needing to import rice to feed their people. And so we'll continue to monitor how that goes. China's resources are also going to be diverted towards the war. It does stimulate the United States economy. There's nothing like a good old fashioned war to stimulate the economy. It also then begins to spark Japan's economy too. North Korea turns in upon itself, becomes a totalitarian state under this correct, it says right wing dictatorship. It's actually a left wing dictatorship. Um, but China does gain prestige on the world stage that they went toe to toe with the Americans. And this means something in that part of the world. The other thing that comes out of this is the organization called SEATO. Now, SEATO is the sister, if you will, of NATO. So it's the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And this is for the same purpose of NATO. It was to contain Chinese and now North Korean communists. It's going to end up being a failure in the long run. It doesn't exist today, but there's going to be some falling outs as a result of some of the infighting between them. But at least it was an attempt. The significance of the war. It's a brutal war. Both sides are going to and document it, torture POWs. The United States are going to use them as guinea pigs, if you will, to test the effects of germ warfare, indiscriminate bombing of civilians, and this is the big one. The United States uses, if you will, biological warfare, weapons of mass destruction on the North Koreans, specifically by dropping anthrax. They drop the plague and other diseases that on top of the North Koreans and the Chinese. The United States was prepared to use any means necessary, essentially, to defend into its sphere of influence in the region. Would we have used these same weapons others? And there's a sense of racism that goes in this. The Asian wars take a different um, perspective, if you will, than what the Europeans had. Um, in the end, The Korean War is a civil war, as we said. The goal was to unify Korea. It is a proxy war because of the ideological opposition of both sides. And it also shows the quote unquote third world entering the Cold War. The third world is not a term we use anymore today. Today we use developing. And so, where this comes from, I think we said this one day, the first world is going to be Western society. The second world is going to be the communist, if you will. So, it's going to be those nations behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, and the third world are going to be those nations that aren't necessarily aligned or that are poor of what we call developing. And so, but what the Korean War does is it sends this message to these quote unquote third worlds that you need to pick a side. That you need to get under this umbrella, and we even call it this. It's called the nuclear umbrella. That you fall into our camp, and we will protect you under this collective security, or you fall into the Soviet Union's umbrella and fall into their nuclear security, if you will. And so, um, the Korean War, in the end, doesn't solve the issues of its day. The United States claims victory in a sense because they successfully defend South Korea. But once they made this a rollback war, and then ultimately retreat back across the 38th parallel, we can see this as a failure in that sense. So hopefully, you got a little bit more understanding of what that is, and we'll talk and how this then brings us into the Vietnam War as well, which is almost the exact same story. So.